Perfect. Hi, everyone. Joining us today, we have Felipe Carrazzo, who is the Head of Public Sector Engagement and Head of Alliance Management from the Tropical Forest Alliance, hosted by the World Economic Forum. We have Sengbi Ng, who is the Sustainable Multi-Oil Manager at AAK. Also joining us is Molly Harrigan, Senior Manager of Responsible Sourcing with the Hershey Company. And finally, my colleague Rob McWilliam, Director of Supply Chain Solutions at Earthworm Foundation. So 2025 was a big milestone for lots of companies who had DCF targets to reach by the end of the year. And there's definitely been some challenges, but there's also been a huge amount of progress. And it can be easy to fall into the trap of moving on to the next target and the next goal without pausing and taking time to reflect. And it is really important that we do reflect because there's been many learnings, and it's key that we take these if we're going to set ourselves up for success going forward. So today we aim to reflect a little, share learnings and acknowledge gaps, and then share thoughts on practical solutions and ideas for working towards building resilient supply chains that can safeguard forests, support farmers, and build healthy food systems for the future. To kick us off, I want to come to Molly and Zengbi. A number of years ago, Hershey and AAK both set DCF targets ending in 2025. And with 2025 just a few months gone, I'm keen to hear from both of you in terms of your company's journeys so far. And so, Molly, I'm going to come to you first. Can you share a little bit more about what has driven progress for Hershey? What genuinely helped Hershey move forward? And were there any certain areas where you felt it was hard or you couldn't make as much progress as you had hoped?
Yes, hi everyone. Thank you for having me here today, Earthworm team. So Molly with the Hershey Company. And as I reflect on our DCF journey over the past few years, I would say a few of the things that really helped us get started was honestly taking the leap. We really got going around our deforestation-free targets in palm oil from the start. We had decent supply chain mapping. There seemed to be a practical solution. We partnered with Earthworm Foundation, as well as Airbus and Starling, and really took the leap. And for palm, we did have a 2025 target. Now, we're a company that has various commodity supply chains that have forest risk. So another big advancement in our journey was around 2023 when we expanded our partnership with Earthworm and Airbus to include the monitoring of our cocoa supply chain as well as our pulp and paper and soy supply chain. And I will say that's where some of the new challenges and learnings started to come to the surface. At the same time, I will share we actually originally had a 2030 deforestation-free policy target. In line with the Science-Based Target Initiative and their flag guidance, we did adjust that to a 2025 more accelerated target, really acknowledging, of course, the role that forests have in helping our climate journey. So I think that the expansion to the cocoa, pulp, paper, and soy revealed quite a lot. Of course, it's very different than the palm oil supply chain. But I think maybe a few buckets where we had some instant learnings was, of course, around traceability and supply chain mapping. Okay, palm, I think, was a more developed industry in terms of just suppliers understanding the expectations on what to share. You have sort of this opportunity to, if you go to a mill level traceability, ideally the way palm is set up, you have some ability to understand around deforestation that could be happening around as a good proxy. Whereas, for example, in soy, we really had never even done supply chain mapping. And so that was a starting point in realizing the complexities of getting engaged with our suppliers there. Also, even just the monitoring tools and understanding it's not a one size fits all approach, of course. But monitoring for deforestation in an agroforestry context or degradation in a pulp and paper plantation looks quite different. And those solutions are still really evolving, I would say. So those were some of the challenges we faced early on. But it's all good learning. And I do say as we hit 2025, we'd already signaled to the industry it was unlikely we would meet our DCF target because a lot of those complexities we were navigating. So here we are today. We now have a 2030 adjusted target. And in our DCF policy, we try to be very transparent about what we can and cannot do. So transparency is key. What's in scope of our DCF target, what's not, based on data availability, solutions that exist, and ideally in partnership with Earthworm and other key industry players and of course our suppliers. Over time, we'll try to continue to evolve that as new data comes to light, as new solutions get developed. But anyways, I will stop for the moment, but those were just sort of partnership is key, and then the challenges are there, and now as an industry, we have to work together.
Thanks, Molly. Yeah, that transparency point I think is definitely an important one. It's something that we're pushing more now, that progress, not perfection, not being afraid uh, to share just because you haven't reached that target. I think so much has been achieved. How can you be positive about that and take those as learnings to move forward? So, yeah, super interesting. Singbi, you come from a different perspective. Molly has shared reflections from a brand. AAK is obviously a midstream supplier with a different perspective. So, can you share your learnings from AAK's DCF journey, perhaps over the last 5 to 10 years, and whether you resonate with any of what Molly shared, or there were quite differences, or quite a few differences in how you experienced it?
Thanks, Lucy. And hi, everyone. Thanks for having me here. I'm Singbi from AAK. I think for AAK or for myself, the reflection of our commitment is really about learning on collaboration. I think we are quite similar to many other companies. We started our deforestation-free journey since the NDPE policy commitment. And since then, we actually see more and more different approaches, strategies, and methodologies has been developed to address this commitment. And of course, the resources spent on it is also really significant. So in the past 5 to 10 years, we see more and more companies have been matured and have more understanding on the requirements. And because of that, more and more alignment were needed across different methodologies and different approach, which is actually a good sign because more and more people are on the journey and then they are on board on this transparency journey. So at the end of 2024, AAK have actually achieved 91% of verified deforestation-free in palm supply chain. And I would say that's definitely thanks to the collaboration with our suppliers and also with multiple service provider or third-party verifier. So that's really a combination of shared responsibility and the trust at the database of our suppliers and third-party consultant like Earthworm, with which we actually expanded our partnership with Earthworm last year. That really helped us a lot in improving the understanding in our supply chain. So I know 2025 is a commitment year for many companies on DCF, including AAK. And many is actually expecting 100% as the final score. But I would like to emphasize actually this is actually not about chasing number, but really to reflect a little bit on what have been done by the industry, what 90% deforestation means to the supply chain. Transparency improved, just like Molly mentioned earlier. We also learned more and more about the challenges on the ground, recognizing the fact that what are the root causes that cause deforestation and finding the long-term solution together with different stakeholders. The progress itself, to me, it's really transforming companies to adopt deforestation-free commitment. And it's already the biggest success throughout the past 10 years, I would say. So I just want to give a bit of positive note to the past 10 years of progress to companies and including AAK.
Thanks, Singbi. I think when it's such a challenging battle we face, it's easy not to think about the positives. I think something that we noted, perhaps bringing another perspective from the brand and the supplier, is that actually in 2025 there was obviously a lot of push for meeting those targets, and so that demand from downstream sometimes meant that there was a particular focus from upstream to downstream in terms of a particular customer supply chain rather than that whole supply chain or the whole supply base. And that's something that we definitely want to focus on going forward, is thinking how can we move beyond that specific supply chain to working at that supplier level, which AAK has obviously been working hard to drive. So building on these reflections, building on kind of DCF progress to date, I want to discuss a little bit about practical tools or emerging approaches that are helping or have helped companies move forward. At Earthworm, we've been monitoring and responding to deforestation with the help of Starling, our co-developed satellite monitoring solution with Airbus. And we've closely worked with suppliers, farmers, and other actors on the ground through our landscape projects. I've also seen really good examples of financial tools like investments that help fund the transition gap for farmers, which have really shown success. So, Rob, coming to you, can you share any approaches or technological innovations that you feel have made the biggest difference in moving the needle and protecting forests?
Great. Thank you, Lucy. Hello, everyone. I would start less on the technology. I'd start more on the people side. I think the people part of the journey over the last 10 years has been absolutely fundamental to get to where we are today, with the results that Sangbi is talking about and Molly, plus many other companies that both Earthworm and many other organizations work with. From a people angle, I think what really was fundamental in the last 10 years is the partnerships that have formed beyond sort of a buyer-supplier relationship. And those partnerships are then starting to work through the buyer and supplier relationship on sustainability issues. I think over the last 10 years, there's been a lot of work done by companies to build the capacity and knowledge of procurement teams so that they can take these conversations around topics of deforestation, peatlands, social issues, so forth, to their suppliers and have those educated conversations or those good conversations about what progress is being made, what are the gaps, what can be done. I think the other part of the people angle is when we started 10 or so years ago on this journey to get to 2025 and where we going forward was all needed a lot of trialing, and there were learnings and there were successes. And now we're starting to take those learnings from those trials and what we succeeded and what we failed in to start scaling. A good example of this is the high carbon stock approach. Back in the early days when some of those first no deforestation policies were being set, everyone threw their hands in the air and said, what is forest? So there was a whole lot of trialing and failing and learning for those first couple of years of the last 10 years to work out what is forest, how do we integrate that into an agricultural setting in a practical, pragmatic way. But fast forward, to the last 5 years, these types of approaches have now emerged into more collaborative efforts around multi-stakeholder collaborations to bring even more maturity to such tools, and to then also embed these tools into certification standards like the RSPO of palm oil. There's other important collaborations with people, of course, happening. I think the Palm Oil Collaboration Group is another great example of that, bringing multiple stakeholders together, not just upstream and downstream in supply chain, but beyond that, around the whole ecosystem, to align on definitions, methodologies, tools, to go back to what Sangbi was saying, to create that alignment so that we all speak the same language and we're all working towards the same target of keeping forests standing inside these agricultural supply chains. Turning to the technological point, yes, Starling, the piece of work that Earthworm and Airbus have been doing for the last 10 years. We're turning 10 this year, hooray. But there's been a whole range of other technologies that I could shout out to as well. But I think this technology has helped us to really identify where forests are, where they are being lost, so that we can react to those loss, where those encroachments are happening. But more importantly, particularly as we go forward, where's that forest still standing? Where's it at risk? How do we get in front of the development agenda that's happening locally? How do we incentivize those forests to stay standing rather than being removed and replaced with agricultural crops? And I think lastly, there's been important initiatives over the last 10 years that really look to empower local communities to gain tenure for their forest areas in these agricultural production settings, and to incentivize, to support, empower those local communities to keep those forests standing. And I think that's an opportunity as we go forward. I'll stop there.
Well, thanks, Rob. Number of different streams of areas that we've made improvements and things that have really been able to drive the needle. Felipe, building on what Rob said, can you share further, perhaps with an example or two or success story or two, partnerships or approaches that you felt have really stood out in driving progress?
Thank you, Lucy, and nice to be here sharing today with many good colleagues here in the panel. Yeah, I think that as it was mentioned, we need to recognize where we are in the journey, right? We've moved, 15 years ago, we were trying to make the case of why deforestation matter and why it was important to engage stakeholders in the quest to address this problem. And we've gone through a series of stages, right? We moved from certification being the early stage, thinking that, there was going to be a premium in the market that will generate a flow of resources to those that are on the upstream. Then we realized we had to do more collaborations. Sengbi, you alluded to what that means. And then, of course, to the traceability agenda, the monitoring that both Molly and Rob have made reference to. And I would say that now we're going into this shared accountability phase, but this is not about just limiting ourselves to better auditing. It's about aligning regulation finance so that incentives can be generated, especially for those in the upstream, for the producers. This brings us, what are the tools? What are the instruments that we can, deploy to try to address this? I think that there's four things that come to my mind. One, how do you create targeted finance and corporate instruments that allows us to, look into deforestation-free related indicators and embed them in credit risk assessments and make them part of the commercial team day-to-day work. How do we look into cost of capital through these indicators and be able to create a better setting in which we move from a reporting burden for the corporates to preferential rates and access to capital for those that are trying to deploy the right solutions. Second tool that comes to mind, it's a bit linked to what, Rob, you were referencing regarding the Starlink. Technology for credibility, right? What's the next generation of MRBs that can allow us to address some of the challenges that Molly was putting together? The application of blockchains for chains of custody, or looking into spatial tech for indirect supplier risk. Those things are important. And then, of course, the remote sensing for landscape and biodiversity, positive outcomes. Another tool, it's, taxonomies. We know that we have a very fragmented space, regulations, standards, and markets all across the world. And one way is, how do you build the right taxonomy so that these instruments, these settings can speak to each other, and we don't end up spreading ourselves thin, especially those that are trying to move forward. And this creates a huge amount of pressure in terms of what do you need to report where. So the taxonomy front it's important as a tool. And then I would say that if we go back to this idea of giving value to the investment, and especially engaging the producer through incentives, there has to be a new architecture on addressing financial flows. And in many cases, we have tools at our disposal. Many companies have created budgets for carbon accounting, but this cannot be deployed on the deforestation agenda because we don't have the right set of metrics that allows us to pair with the SBTI, right, and make sure that avoided deforestation gets formally recognized in these metric frameworks. So there's a lot of work on these tools, but I would say, and just to finalize, that we also have to look at the approaches, right? We cannot ignore the interconnection along the supply chains. What happens in decisions in one side of the system, would it be in production, market demand, trade laws, incentives, has a repercussion in other ends. And we're starting to see this in many ways, not only within the traditional markets, but also with the emerging markets. And this is what happens with China, which is really, really a big, important consumer of these commodities, but it's starting to shape up its strategy, not looking into just a buyer requirement. They're basically trying to reshape the trade architecture by how does food security comes into the picture? How does embedded carbon gets factored in? How does geopolitical supply security and competitive advantages play out? There's a lot of work happening in how China is framing the conversations with Indonesia on palm oil supply chains, but also in terms of the connections with South America on the soy and beef with DCF trading operations already taking place. So tools matter, but alignment of incentives across trade corridors is what ultimately will change behaviors. Over to you, Lucy.
No, thanks, Felipe, for sharing. I think as you were speaking, I was thinking through, we definitely need to try and bring in an element of simplicity and be driving towards simplicity because this space has got so complex. I mean, you didn't talk so much about the frameworks, but everything around kind of the greenhouse gas and the flag guidance and DCF targets under SBTI and trying to work out how you claim under one versus what's included under the other. And then thinking about all the things that we actually want to be doing and the restoration and all the good that is achieving is maybe then not recognized through these systems is a real challenge. So in some ways, I think we've got some work to do in trying to create simplicity and spend less time trying to understand what fits under these frameworks and more time on doing the good action. Rob, you touched on it a little bit. You talked about local communities, but we haven't touched so much on smallholders, and many of the hardest challenges sit with smallholder inclusion. So, Felipe, perhaps you want to start, or Rob, or others. What approaches have you seen that generally integrate smallholders rather than exclude them?
Well, maybe what I can jump on board, and then Rob, happy for you to complement. What I would like to mention is that smallholders are not the problem, right? They are basically how we go about this smallholder engagement is a stress test to whether the systems that we're trying to deploy are designed correctly, right? So if we have a system that basically cuts the rest by ditching the smallholder to the side, it's not a robust system, right? Compliance costs cannot simply cascade downstream and create a not desired effect. If the system only works for large producers, it would not scale up. Rob, you made reference to the importance of this scaling up. So we have to make sure that there's a shift from an audit-based enforcement to a partnership-based upgrading that brings inclusion, that has technical support, provides or generates aggregation models for these smallholders. It brings financial de-risking, and of course, has realistic timelines, but that it gets accompanied by those incentives that I made reference to before.
Yeah, I think from a practical implementation standpoint, what I've seen over the last couple of years in particular, and it was all, we can't ignore smallholders, we shouldn't. They need to be included. They'll always be part of the supply chain and fundamental to supplying the raw materials, whatever raw material we're talking about. So I think what I've seen as more practical approaches is that companies as buyers or suppliers sort of starting to acknowledge that we can't collect GPS points for every farmer in the world. Whether there's a challenges of collecting that data, there's a cost of collecting that data, and sometimes there's regulatory issues of collecting that data. So taking stock of that, then what are more practical approaches to assessing where forests and forest loss is at risk? What are the dynamics of those forest loss events? So is it more smallholder driven based on analytics that can be done with the data captured from space? And then trying to identify the most suitable engagement point to not to penalize for forest loss in those cases. I think it's more about what do we do about the forest that's still to be lost or could be conserved if we look at it more a positive way. And then how do we bring those incentives that Felipe was talking about to those local actors, the smallholders, to conserve the forest without, again, penalizing them for not clearing forest or you just have to make do with the production plots that you've got that you cleared years ago, right? I don't think that's the best outcome as well for forests or for local people. So it's going to be a bit of a tricky balance as we go forward to work out how we get that right between the production and the conservation. But I think there's some emerging approaches that are starting to percolate out of all the work that's happened over the last 10 years to help us in that journey in the next 10 years.
Great, thanks, Rob. I think that's a good segue for shifting the angle and moving to thinking about um, how the future looks. So we've talked about commitments and tools to achieve DCF supply chains, but compliance, whether it's regulatory or voluntary, is really just the baseline. And what's great to see is businesses starting to treat it not as the end goal, but as the foundation. And that's because less bad isn't good enough. We need to think about how to do more good. So instead of less bad, how do we do more good? Actively creating value for nature, climate, and people, rather than just reducing down that extractive process. And what some of the more ambitious companies are starting to ask is how do we design our supply chains so they contribute to restoration, biodiversity, farmer livelihoods, and the future of supply, rather than just tackling risk and risk of deforestation. So I'd like to explore that shift. Sengbi, coming to you first, what does that actually look like in practice, moving beyond DCF compliance?
No problem. Thanks, Lucy. Yeah, I think like you mentioned, deforestation free is definitely not the end point. While we can continue to close the remaining gap in the supply chain, I think we want to look into leveraging deforestation free itself as a tool now, to help us achieve not just compliance or reporting purposes, but also on a bigger agenda in, for example, our climate target, in SBTI flag target, in our biodiversity protection, as well as the local communities and also the indigenous people's protection there. I think it's also an approach that allows us to link our final product back to the production, assuring us that the product are coming from responsible practices in the supply chain. It does help to shift conversation from just compliance to how far beyond compliance we can actually go. Just like Rob mentioned earlier, nowadays we have a lot of technologies. Company can actually easily access to deforestation detection through satellite monitoring. So building on that, understanding what the number could mean to our climate, biodiversity, and people is more and more critical, as we could leverage this for a more holistic approach for multiple tier suppliers in the supply chain. And considering deforestation free is just mitigating negative risk, then now we need to look into creating positive impact on the other side of the system. And that's also something interesting point that Felipe mentioned earlier, for example, how deforestation free play out in food security, or how could we connect the resources we have spent in deforestation free into generating positive impact on human rights, for example. So at the end of the day, I think rethink about how we spend on our resources and then collectively finding a way for a right partnership with a holistic approach that could be a win-win situation for all of us. And I would also like to emphasize that deforestation free, it does give us the infrastructure or the language or the leverage to move from a single issue compliance kind of to actually the next level, which is the systemic level of responsibility. So that's why I think the understanding on the root cause of deforestation is also far more important than just looking at the number or being free from deforestation. Over to you, Lucy.
Thanks, Singbi. Yeah, I resonate with a lot of that. I think, it's particularly given what we're seeing around the world, the focus absolutely needs to be on protecting future supply and going beyond just the number and thinking, why are systems like they are, and therefore how can we address those root problems. Molly, maybe coming at it from a similar perspective, but how are you thinking about forest protection and restoration from the lens of resiliency and future-proofing supply versus regulatory compliance?
Yeah, and I think just to agree, second B, a lot of what you shared absolutely resonates. And I think, Lucy, the way you've even framed this section, you've already like nailed a lot of the key messages and points of what we're starting to think about or have been thinking about for some time. But absolutely echo, I agree. It is not just about DCF only anymore. That is a starting point. It is important. but it is a starting point. How do we go towards positive impact? And I think, right, it's not just about how do we prove no deforestation, but actually make sure we're focusing on how to keep those important natural ecosystems and forests standing. And so I'm not going to focus too much on regulation besides saying that, of course, regulation plays a role. It can help. Ideally, it is helping raise the bar in certain instances, but I do think we all, as the industry, have an opportunity to really look beyond that. And yes, it's about supplier resilience, strengthened farm systems that are able to withstand climate volatility for the future, to make sure we still have a strong farmer base and strong farmer community that is able to live a stable lifestyle and have income coming in and feel empowered for the future. And it is about having the supply as well. So I do think some of the way we are starting to think about it at Hershey is, yes, deforestation free is part of it. And then how are we thinking about the broader supply resilience? And so what does that mean in terms of thinking of the viability of landscapes? So not just the forest or like not just the specific supply chain connection, but the actual supply shed or landscape, a bit broader thinking about the communities. How do we make sure that they're viable over the long term? One other thing on our mind is how do we increase and improve yield and ultimately support strengthen farmer livelihoods on land that's already under cultivation versus like really, how do we prevent that forest expansion to meet, like, I think a lot of us know by 2050, there will probably be about 2 billion more people on the world. And so how do we make sure that we can meet that growing population needs on land that's already under cultivation today? And what type of technologies and support could be there? So that's definitely something to be considering. And then as everyone has continued to say, collaboration is key, and it's about harmonized approaches, testing and learning across industry groups, like Rob said, Consumer Goods Forum, POCG, but then also with our suppliers. We're, as the brand, we have suppliers who are doing a lot of the work that are connected to the upstream supply chain, and how do we continue to amplify and support work that's being done, as well as with key partners like Earthworm or civil society. So as Sengbi already mentioned, but this was something that I also wanted to conclude, is DCF is really about risk mitigation. But I think it's really exciting that the next direction of this conversation is about positive impact with keeping forests standing.
Awesome. Thanks, Molly. Before we move on and we talk about the future, just bringing together both of those pieces where, although we're wanting to still move forward, I think most companies will be maintaining DCF targets or renewing those. And so there can be a bit of tension between regulatory compliance and more holistic landscape level or people-centered approaches, even if it's just for time on resource. But obviously there are many more deeper challenges than that. Rob, Felipe, or Molly or Sangbi, you can build. Wonder if you want to touch on that point. Have you seen any of those tensions playing out within your own companies, or maybe for Felipe and Rob, the companies that you're working with?
Yes, I think that we are all learning, and I think that it becomes a challenge. How do you separate who really, really wants to go through with this type of new paradigm linked to production, and who's just trying to, be relevant, stay relevant just because of what's happening? I think, and it becomes very promising when you hear, Molly and Sengbi, from where they stand, from their companies, trying to say, we have to continue to move forward. At the end, it's not about the constructs that we put together to show progress, is how do we mainstream the commitments in our day-to-day. Moving forward, I see there's three spaces that require a lot of refinement, one being inclusion, especially producer inclusion. And that's the missing link. The producers are the missing link of the huge equation, because it's hard to get them to be part of this scheme from a systemic standpoint. How do you bring down the incentives, as I mentioned? Then the other point is resilience, and the third one's innovation. So on inclusion, niche supply chains will not eliminate the landscape risk, right? There's so many spaces for leakages, that we have to really create that enabling environment for those incentives to be an instrument to bring the producers on board. There's a lot of tension there. How do you go about those instruments? There's a lot of negotiation between a lot of sectors, but we have to strive to continue to create those safe spaces for dialogue and engagement that allows, the financial sector, the corporate sector, the governments would be, from producer countries, from consumer countries, to keep moving forward this agenda. We can have companies achieving 100% deforestation-free sourcing, but that would not necessarily eliminate the problem in the long term. It has to be a collective effort. Now, I like the resilience point. Sengbi, you mentioned, deforestation in itself is not the end. Tackling deforestation or DCF compliance has to be a means for an end. And Molly, you were referring to resilience. What does this mean? Well, maybe resilience is the objective, right? Like compliance reduces risk, but resilience is what protects long-term supply chain security. And this becomes then an agenda of its own. It's about supply stability, and this should be something that allows us to see this more as a niche agenda. I think that one of the challenges that we have is that we still see the deforestation-free agenda as a complementary niche within the broader economics. No, how do we go about this systematically? How do we bring insurance companies and others to be part of the solution? So the resilience piece is, I don't see a lot of tension there. I just see that we still don't have the answers, but now there's a collective effort that brings us into, okay, we have to move forward because a lot of people are on board regardless of the constructs and regardless of where we are with the commitments that we have set up. And I will finalize saying that we should not forget about innovation. Our colleagues in the panel made a lot of great, interventions linked to transparency. Yes, it's not an end in itself to build traceability, but traceability is a tool to create transparency. It's essential because we need that credibility. Visibility matters. And this is somehow what we get out of deploying traceability and creating transparency, but the impact still there. So impact matters more. Positive impact matters more. And we have to continue to demonstrate that it's achievable. For that, we need to innovate. We have to create I think we should see these elements as traceability, forest governance at the upstream, as economic infrastructure. And if we do that, then we might be able to mobilize more investment in research and development that could allow us to tackle these things and then get to the impact side of things as we deploy our strategies. I'll stop here and happy to hear more from others.
Thanks, Felipe. I'll keep us moving as I know we've only got a few more minutes and then we're going to head into Q&A, but thanks for sharing lots of useful, interesting ideas there. Let's just spend a couple of minutes continuing to look forward. Let's say we have the business case in place. We know what resilience means. We've got that nailed down and we're focusing more efforts on forest protection and restoration. What does that next generation of forest action actually look like? Obviously, there's great innovation models out there. We talked about finance, incentives for producers, landscape projects. But as resilience has become a core theme, so obviously is collaboration rather than competing and taking what we have to build together and collaborate to achieve success. So, Rob, what gives you the most confidence on strengthening action to protect forests?
Yeah, I think, look, if the business case is there, which it is, and it is for many, and it's already there in an intangible way for most of us anyway. We know how important forests are to the production of raw materials, but to the functioning of ecosystems, to the livelihoods of local people, for us as all these people on Earth. So the business case is there. But I think what needs now to come is sort of how we back that business case with money. In particular, and how we get those flows of money, which has been referred to others on the panel here today, to the right people on the ground to conserve forests. They're worth so much money to us. I think we are really starting to build a better understanding of how much they're worth, and then work out how do we find that money to then get those flows into the right places. I think that is a hope that we can tackle in the next 10 years as soon as we can in the next 10 years. There's some good examples already. The Forest Conservation Fund that Earthworm has also helped to establish in the early days is one of those examples. There are other examples of this where working with those local communities to build those conservation projects, provide opportunities for companies like Hershey's and others to contribute money to those communities to keep those forests standing. It doesn't cost a lot of money for now. And I think wherever those opportunities are, get behind them as quickly as you can because the case is there. I think I'd go back to one of the points Molly was making before as well about sort of enhancing production on the existing production areas and the role that both technology and collaborations have to increase yields, to improve quality of raw materials coming from the existing production base rather than constantly looking to expand. Hopefully that would help us feed, clothe, fuel the 2 billion new people that will be part of the planet in the coming years. Great examples coming out of some of our work in Thailand, for example, with rubber smallholders and integrating agroforestry into a traditional monocultural system. We've done a lot of measurements over the life of this project to demonstrate that there is an increase in yield and there's an increase in the quality of the rubber. And therefore that links to a better income for the farmer, improving their livelihoods and their living income status. So I think these are important to reflect on how we do that better. And I think the last I would talk to is the relationship that we can expand between business and government. I think governments do have a key role to play around the world, but particularly where forests still stand at risk of further expansion. We've done some really great work in the Ivory Coast, for example, with cocoa encroachment into forest reserves on the west of the country. And that's resulted in, for the first time ever, the Cavalli Forest Reserve, which is now a nature reserve, having zero deforestation. There's no further encroachment into that area, at least on our most recent monitoring data sets. That's fantastic. What a result. But what we need to now work out is how to take that business to government collaboration that's had that incredible result and see how we can influence the expansion of cocoa and other raw materials into frontiers just across the border into Liberia. And that's an exciting opportunity that we can leverage through the existing partnerships and successes that we've had to take that into new places and see how we can replicate the success of keeping forests standing.
Absolutely. Felipe, do you want to share any thoughts building on what Rob said around kind of innovations, whether that's incentivization schemes or shifts in power dynamics or other principles that you think could be super beneficial going forward?
Yes, of course. And in a way, I already I got ahead of myself. There's a lot of passion to these discussions. I think that building on what Rob mentioned, the next frontier is in aligning forest production with the macroeconomic schemes, right? And to achieve this, and this is something that has been heavily identified. We need to really elevate the conversation, have a more structured, multi-stakeholder type of engagements that can double down on connecting, corporate policy, government investment, and financial institutions. And I think that we have to double down on the engagement of the financial institutions. Why? Because finance itself, the tools that we have at hand, and this comes to your point, Rob, on financial flows, they must diversify in this space of deforestation action. We have to evolve, and I think it was Molly or Sengbi that mentioned, we have to evolve from just risk assessment, the traditional model, and try to have an enabling transition, a set of an investment on enabling transition that has to be systematic and long term, because we're seeing the forest as an asset, and not only the forest, the services that come about for the productivity and the economic growth that happens.
Well, thanks, Felipe. Thanks, everyone. I think we'll head into a little bit of Q&A. I know we've had several questions that have been submitted by the audience. So if you've got any last questions and you haven't yet shared them, please do so in the Q&A box or in the chat, and we'll get through as many as we can. So Molly, I'm going to come to you first. We had a question going back to the beginning when we were speaking about DCF targets. So you talked about your a new DCF target or policy for 2030, and there was questions around whether that's already been shared and how did you approach this with SBTI in absence of guidance beyond 2025, given that that was coming later in the day and we were already at the end of 2025 when new information was shared.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, so our policy, I was hoping it would be on our website by today. It should be on our website sometime, hopefully today, but before end of this week. So stay tuned. We do have our DCF implementation approach document on our website, and that does start indicating a lot of, as I mentioned in my first part, around like some of the limitations, challenges, what's in scope, what's not. So that is available already if you're interested in seeing that. And then I think as it relates to the SBTI flag guidance, in general, our policy and the work we're doing, it's not a static, this is what we're doing today, and therefore that's the next 5 years plan. So I think, Lucy, as you mentioned, this is about progress, not perfection. We knew 2025 target was coming to an end. We already had line of sight in terms of the work that we needed to continue doing. And so we're able to put forth our future policy and plans based on what we think, we as Hershey need to do for the world, what the world needs from us, or the planet, I guess, world. And then we'll continue to evolve as, flag guidance is out now. And I think AF Accountability Framework Initiative, I believe, should also be having new guidance out soon. So we'll continue to take this in, look at how that might be integrated into our approach, ways we could further advance, or ways that maybe like a policy needs to be adjusted over time, just as any company should be constantly, reviewing, reevaluating their approach. But that's just in today's world, we knew that our target, we did not achieve it. So how do we continue making progress and advancing the work that we know needs to go get done?
Thanks, Molly. Similar realm, I want to talk about certification, but I'm going to again open it up to anybody to answer, so feel free to jump in. The question is around what role voluntary certification schemes play in deforestation free journeys. So again, different perspectives here in terms of whether it's specifically your company's DCF journey or whether you can speak on behalf of members that you work with.
Oh, Rob, and let's see, I'm happy to say something. Go ahead, Rob.
Yeah, I think they have played a role, certification schemes, in helping to protect forests. In particular, where those certification schemes have had clear principles and criteria around high conservation value, high carbon stock, as I mentioned at the start of the panel with the RSPO, but the high conservation value toolkit as a way to identify around one of 6 values that forests can be assessed against is embedded into a whole range of certification schemes, including the FSC for production forests. So those play an important role, I think, for forest conservation, for sure. The challenge I see, however, is that certification always has that limit in terms of its scope in covering the full production of the raw material, whether it's palm oil or whether it's pulp and paper or timber for furniture we sit on or tables that we sit at and so forth. So I think it plays an important role, but it shouldn't be it's not the only tool in the toolbox, is what I'd say.
Maybe just to chime in from a brand perspective, indeed, I agree with Rob. I think certification, it's a risk mitigation tool from a brand perspective in terms of the material coming into our physical supply chain. And also we know on the ground for certified producers, there is a positive impact. So I'm not trying to discount that either, but it is one, from a brand perspective, it does typically enable a bit more transparency on the supply chain mapping on maybe the producers at origin. So it helps from a verification, monitoring, assessment point of view. But I think it doesn't discount exactly as you said, Rob. We still have to play an active role in the supply shed and landscape action, and really making sure just because our little origin of where we're getting something maybe is fine, we know climate impacts don't have a specific like supply chain that they follow. They impact everything. And so I think if we're not looking at the broader landscape, the broader impacts, then we're not really actually thinking of our broader stability for supply chain resilience.
Thanks, Molly. Rob, a question for you. Moving on, thinking about funds and success. So, what examples do you have of some of the more successful forest conservation funds? How are they structured, and what perhaps made them successful?
Yeah, there's a whole range, and maybe Felipe you could probably talk about this better than I in some instances, particularly around sort of the G to G kind of funds that work. So governments paying governments for Red Plus, for example, or from the financing facilities through the World Bank and so forth. So yeah, those are ways to do it. They've had success, but there's still more success to be had. I think that's what's spurred on perhaps at a different level, more bottom up, where these community conservation projects like the Forest Conservation Fund is supporting. I think one of note, and I can't speak too much about the structuring of it, but I've heard some of the great work that Lestari Capital are also doing as an example in Indonesia and beyond Indonesia in terms of working with multiple stakeholders to conserve large areas of forest and incentivize the conservation of that forest. So yeah, the kind of three kind of levels I see from government to large conservation initiatives through to more bottom-up local initiatives from communities themselves. Felipe, maybe you have to add.
Yeah, I can share more. I think that as you mentioned, there's an enormous portfolio of funds. I think it's the challenge is how you deploy those funds and for what and when, right? Like if you have funds that help us address, underlying causes of deforestation, like, the REDD related funds, how does that play out in such a way that you can engage the government structures to create the right policies that allow you to tap the underlying causes? And yes, you have to probably accompany this with funds that could also provide some little incentive to keep the owner of the forest engaged. But I think that there's also some spaces where we need to create new systems. If we want to look at this agenda in a comprehensive manner, and then we start, as I mentioned, into the macroeconomics, then what are the funds? And I just put there in the chat an example, the catalytic capital for the agricultural transition investment fund, which is a new fund, is trying to create conditions to bring or to de-risk the investment of more traditional funds that can allow the companies to start to deploy the solutions and tools that are required. So the financial architecture is not easy, it's complex, but we just have to be very diligent on how we create the right instruments so that the incentives, again, incentives can be dependent on funds that are going to pay you one day or the other. They have to be embedded in the economics. They have to flow through the business models in such a way that the producers are part of the beneficiaries of the economy and not side players. But again, we have to innovate on those funds, and there's a wide array that, depending on where your organization sits, you can tap or not to try to move forward your agenda.
Yeah, super interesting. Coming to, I think what we'll do is we'll go to a bit of a quick fire now. So what I'm going to do is ask each of our speakers a quick fire question, and I'd like you to respond with either a couple of words, one or two sentences, but something fairly short. So what is a practical change, big or small, that could make the biggest difference for forest action across supply chains in the near future? Sengbi, if you're okay, perhaps I'll start with you and then you can pass on to someone else.
Absolutely, no problem. Yeah, I think it is always about aligning the definition and then also managing the expectation of everyone. It's also about matching the timeline because as we know, it's evident since the past 10 years, we know it's an ongoing journey. So therefore, it's definitely a long-term agenda for everyone. And we should not always set a deadline for us and look into a really long-term partnership for all. Yeah.
Molly, oh, Felipe, you've unmuted. Go for it.
I can jump in. For me, it's more about, well, I'm looking more at the macro, right? But I would put it like this. We need to evolve from a supplier level compliance model to a production area resilience model.
Nice, short and sweet. I like that, Felipe, a lot. I would say two quick things is collaboration. We have to be a part of a collaborative approach. And then also, just especially when I think of more of the brand lens, transparency, share your progress, share the challenges. I think showing action and efforts taken is required as we think about the future of our work.
Very simple, and maybe it's linked a little bit to the collaboration. But ask your supplier, whether you're a brand with a tier one supplier or you're buying from a small farmer and so forth. But ask, what can we do to strengthen forest conservation outcomes in your area or in your supply chain? It is that simple. I know it's not always that simple to implement, but I think that question can open up a whole range of opportunities and needs and support areas that we can work on together in the next 5-10 years.
Thanks, everyone. Definitely good diversity of ideas there. So we've got 1 minute left. I'm going to wrap up. Just taking a few points for today. I think there's been some core themes there. And whilst DCF commitments have driven progress, we've got a lot to do to move beyond tackling deforestation to actively protect forests. And if we're going to move from risk avoidance to value creation, then the next phase of forest action could definitely look very different. I think we've also reflected on the fact that we've built systems for monitoring and measuring and managing risk. We've got plenty of information out there. Felipe, you touched on it. We've got risk assessment galore, really, but the real challenge, I guess, lies in working together collaboratively at the speed and scale required, but perhaps more challengingly with the right financial structures. So thank you to our speakers, Felipe, Sengbi, Rob, and Molly, for sharing your insights and expertise. And thanks everybody for joining today. If you do have any further questions or would like to connect directly with any of us or with the Earthworm team, please drop us an email. I think contact details will either be in the chat or they will also be shared after the webinar, along with the recording in a follow-up email. So yeah, thanks everybody. Let's continue the conversation and the hard work, and hopefully we'll see you all again soon.
Thank you.
Bye
Thank
bye.
you. Bye bye.
Bye bye, everyone.